Welcome back to the College Prep Podcast, everyone. I'm Megan Dorsey from collegeprepresults.com, where I help students with SAT and ACT test taking. I'm here today with my co-host.
Hey everyone, I'm Edward from Alma Mater, which is a place for students and educators to learn all the strategies that we need to earn a life-changing education in college. And so today, Megan, I'd love to dive into note-taking. The newness and excitement of the new year has started to wear off, and all of those plans of I'm going to be the best student ever, and I organized my backpack, and I'm going to do all the readings. Those things are starting to slip a little bit. And so I think this is a great time to talk about reinvigorating ourselves during lecture with note taking. And I've noticed that a lot of students kind of run into one of three major issues. So, what I want to do is unpack some of these big trouble traps that I see students fall into, and then give a better template that we can follow to be a better note taker.
And I think this is really important because so many high school students really have not had the experience of taking lecture notes. We're so engaged in doing different activities in our high school classes these days that so many students just really get to college and have no earthly idea what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear your suggestions.
Yeah, totally. And on that note, I will say there's just a lot of research out there that shows most students just aren't prepared for college. A lot of the strategies you use to survive high school, and they're valid strategies in high school, they just don't hold up when we get to a college campus anymore. So if we can start practicing some of those college level strategies before we ever get there, we're going to be way ahead of everyone else, which is good. So the first big myth that I hear that students fall into is I don't need to take any notes because I've got all the slides, right? And I feel like this is also common in high school. Um,
Very.
there's no need to take the notes, right? And that happens because either you've got copies of the slides or your high school teachers tend to give you a study guide, which is an amazingly handy thing before every exam. And it has literally every question that's going to be on the test. And so all you've got to do is do the study guide, and you didn't have to pay attention to anything they said all semester. Unfortunately, we typically don't get study guides in college. And so that's why we can't fall into this thinking of, I don't need to take notes. And you see, this is a problem because some professors do give the slides. Those study guides are less common. They'll give you the slides. And so students think, if I know everything they're going to share in class anyways, why am I going to waste my time and my energy writing these things down? And that's valid. But I will just throw out there that the big trap here is that if you've got the slides, what that does is it kind of lulls you into this false sense of security. And you think, I don't have to pay attention. I can go ahead and check my social. I can work on my English paper or something else during lecture because I know everything they're talking about, anyways. And that just isn't true, right? Bulleted form is not all they're sharing in lecture. So that's big trap number one. Big trap number two that students fall into is I do take notes, but then when I go back to my notes, they're actually not very good. They're not very usable. And I'm not sure why I wrote the things I wrote down. And for some reason, all the stuff on the test isn't in my notes. And so I didn't study the right stuff. And that is very common. What exactly should I be writing down in my notes? And then the final trap that I see students, the big three, is they write down everything word for word. And this is typically the students sitting in the front row, front and center.
They're trying to do it right.
They're trying their best to do it right. And actually, learning science tells us that isn't the right way to take notes. And it seems so counterintuitive. You know, you're hanging on to every word, you're scribbling down everything from the slides, everything the professor says. Well, what you end up with is a textbook after lecture. But you've already got a textbook. You don't need another one. And on top of that, research shows that most students actually never go back to their notes. And in fact, there is a correlation that shows the more someone writes in their notes, the less likely they are to look at them in the future. So it's just totally against what you would assume to be true.
One of
So,
the interesting things that I found when I was in college, and when I was in college, it was just then becoming really popular to record the lectures. You had small enough, this is terrible, tape cassette recorders that you could bring them to class and record lecture. And I always thought to myself, why on earth would I sit through it twice? If I'm here taking notes, why would I do it twice? And that's what I kept thinking when you described the person who wants to reread the slides or the person who's writing everything down. And what you say is nobody does want to sit through it twice. They don't go back and use them. To
Right.
me, it was like, I'm just going to take good notes and be here once. And then if I need to, I'll go back over my notes.
Yeah,
Nobody
totally.
wants to do the whole thing twice.
Yeah, right. It's a waste of your time, and we already feel strained and stressed as college students. You already have so much going on. Why add sitting through double the amount of lectures? It doesn't make sense. However, I will just say on that note, there are some very sophisticated technologies now. Like as you're writing notes, it will record the entire session and you can tap on your notes and it will play back that section of the lecture, which is great, which is genius. Like if we can afford to get a hold of that technology, great, let's use it. I know that a lot of tablets like iPads are starting to include these kinds of features now. This does bring up a question around integrity, around recording. Do we need to inform our professor if we're recording them or not? Because based on your state, if they say something maybe they shouldn't be saying, that could hold up as evidence in a court of law, right? So there are professors who will say, do not record this lecture. And then there are some who are totally fine with you doing that. So be sure that we're aware of those rules so no one's getting in
That's a
trouble.
good reminder to everybody.
Yes, absolutely. So then let's talk about instead what is a process we can use to take notes. And I'm curious, did you ever get any like explicit note-taking instruction when you were in high school? Can you remember if any teacher did?
My best note taking instruction was probably my junior, senior year participating in speech and debate.
Mm,
And we did talk about using abbreviations. There's no way you can write everything down. You have to be writing things down and preparing to respond. So that was probably the best instruction I got, but it was not specific to note taking in general.
yeah. I got to sit through a painful presentation on Cornell note-taking.
Oh,
I
that became a fad for a while.
Yeah, it was very trendy. Cornell notes are still, there's validity. I get it. I understand why we use Cornell notes. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Cornell notes, it's a system where we write the bulk of our notes on the right-hand side of the paper, and we use the margins to scribble down any questions or to identify major topics or themes, and then we leave a space empty at the bottom to write a summary, a recap. So it makes total sense to me why people would use the Cornell structure. However, that wasn't explained to me why I should be using this structure. I was just given a blank handout with Cornell already on it. And I assumed this is how the smart kids are taking notes. So I should probably be doing this too. And the thing about this process I'm going to go over right now is that it's highly personal. And I think whenever we try to squeeze ourselves into a note-taking model, though it's good to experiment with and know at first, recognize it's probably not the right thing for you. And like you mentioned, what's actually better is starting to come up with your own systems, whether that's abbreviations or visuals or whatever your style is. So hopefully these kind of give us an idea of how to start developing our note-taking style.
And I like
So
the idea that you say it's personalized because that's been my complaint with every specific note taking strategy or trend that's come along is, well, I sort of do that, but I do it a little differently. And what I have done has worked well for me. And I've never found that things are particularly adaptable.
yeah, totally, totally. So this is very personal, as learning should be, right? There is no
That's right.
pre-done way to do it because our brains are also unique. They're also different. So we've got to just experiment and be aware. So as I'm going through these three steps, I'd love for any students listening to just kind of get a little metacognitive. I love that word and saying, let me think about which of these things will actually work for me. Which things do I do? Which things have I never tried before? And then if you're a parent or educator, prompt your student to start thinking about their notes and not just follow some template or idea of what they think they should be doing when they're taking notes. So, the first big thing we need to do is that we need to zoom out and we need to start becoming big picture thinkers. A lot of us, when we're sitting in lecture, especially the students that tend to write notes at all, or especially overwrite notes, we are so focused on the detail. What is that person's name again? When was the formula invented? And we're getting so granular, and the problem with this is that it's taking up all of our brain's reserves. So there's this thing called cognitive load theory, which says your brain really only has so much capacity to do things at one time. And so we want to reduce how much our brain is actually doing at once so that we can focus. This is why we should not be watching a lecture while scrolling social, while eating the bag of chips. No one likes you if you're doing that. And while, writing your English essay at the same time and texting. We don't learn that way. Our brains are just overwhelmed in general. And so I've got to think, how do I relieve my brain of some of these tasks so it can just pay attention to what it should be paying attention to? And this is what I mean by becoming a big picture thinker. Instead of worrying about tiny little details the professor is sharing, we instead need to ask ourselves, what are the big themes here? What is the process that's being explained? What is the timeline? And how do these things connect to the knowledge I already have, to things I read in the textbook, which we should be doing before lecture? How can I connect all of these things together? And I'm not focused on tiny details. And that's because we can always turn to the textbook and to Google and to AI later to get those tiny little details. It's okay if they slip. Instead, we want to be selective with what we're writing. And I like to tell students, if we're freeing ourselves of copying down everything, it gives us an opportunity to sit back and just soak in and let our brains process what's actually being said because we're not so focused on writing things down. And so I like to tell students what's happening when we're writing a bunch of stuff. Is the lecture's coming in through our ears, it's traveling down to your fingertips onto the paper, and then you're never going to look at it again. So it's really not very valuable. We want it to get stuck in our brains. And so our notes, when we're big picture thinkers, actually become a transcript of what's happening in our brains. What is the learning that's happening? What things surprised you? What did you learn that's new? What feels familiar? Was there a light bulb aha moment, like a breakthrough? Those are the things that we can't go back and capture later. So that's what we want our notes to feel like, sort of this big overview process, not tiny granular details.
So for a student who this is all new to them, they're going in and getting ready to take notes in college lectures for the first time. You would say, don't worry about the details, the exact spelling of names, the dates. You can come back and get clarification on those from the textbook or other sources. Instead, follow the big trends.
Exactly. We're focusing on the big trends. And the reason for that is, let's say we're in a history class and we're talking about the effects of World War One, right? Out and how they still affect the present day, for example. If your professor is sharing about that topic, we can always look up the dates World War One happened later. And here's the thing, you will never have a college exam that says, what years did World War One happen? That's high school stuff, right? We're not doing that anymore. Instead, we're focused on what were the impacts of World War One? How did it forever change the course of history? How does it affect our alliances today? How does it affect our oil industry, for example? Those are the connections that are being fleshed out in class. And you're going to miss those things because you're so focused on getting the dates right in your notes and who's on whose side. We can look that stuff up later. But all of the genius that your professor is kind of spewing out in lecture and the things that are happening in your brain as it's reacting, those things we can't get back. We can't look that up because it only exists in that class, in that context. So that's why big picture is so important.
And
So
I
now,
think that's important for people to hear and understand because I had so many people say, well, I read the textbook. Why do I need to go to lecture? Well, they're not reading the textbook out loud. There's something more that's coming through there.
yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get to that in step number three. So I'm glad
Okay.
you brought that up. In step number two, we're actually going to start getting visual and we're going to start personalizing our notes. So you mentioned you might have a system of abbreviations for yourself. And abbreviations are great because it speeds you up. So that way you're not spending so much time writing and you can take pauses to pay attention. And so there is some research to show that as you're writing, you're starting to block out all the new information that's happening. If someone were taking notes of this lecture right now, of not, sorry, not a lecture, of this podcast right now, they're writing what I just said 10 seconds ago. They're not listening to what I'm saying right now. And so that's why it's so important to create these gaps for ourselves as we're writing. And so with getting visual, things like abbreviations and drawing arrows and circling things that are supposed to be grouped together so that you signal your brain to say, okay, these things are connected. Let me go try to flesh out why these things are connected later. And you can really sit and absorb. You know now, okay, they are connected, but all I did was draw an arrow to connect them together. And along with this, that means break the rules. If we're using line paper to take notes, our brain wants to fit it into this hierarchy, this outline format of taking notes. And this is very beneficial sometimes for things like a chemistry course or, a calculus course But this is definitely not how our brain is thinking about history. For example, our brains tend to think in this very messy, disorganized way. And so things like mind mapping are actually much more true and similar to what's happening in our brains than a line, straight outline on a paper. And so we want to encourage ourselves to say, let me break the rules here. Let me get a little bit visual. Let me draw arrows. Let me just capture these big ideas and then free up space instead of making an outline after class. And so this is that personalization process. Other little note here is please leave gaps in your notes when note taking. I think we want to make our notes nice and pretty, especially now there's this trend of these aesthetic notes. You see them all over online,
Sort
and
of bullet journal
yeah,
style.
they're beautiful. The beautiful notes. I'm willing to bet these creators who are putting out this content are not doing this while sitting in a lecture. These things are happening after the fact or with their own studying. They're not lecture notes. The notes you take in lecture should be messy because it's that what's happening in your brain, and we need to leave white spaces because there is nothing worse than having this full beautiful outline of what your professor's been saying and then they say, "Oh, wait, I forgot to mention." And then you go back up and you think, now, how do I squeeze this in? You just ruined my notes. I don't have room for it. And then it leaves no space for you to move on later and add more to your notes as you flesh out your understanding doing the homework or rereading the textbook or however you're studying. So we want to make sure we're giving ourselves gaps in our notes intentionally. Every time we switch topics, leave yourself a space so that we can go back and flesh those things out if we need to in the future. And that's how we're going to make those notes feel much more visual for step number 2. The final thing we're going to do is paying attention to signals. And so often students aren't sure what they should be writing. And especially if you're just not used to taking notes in class, how do you know what to write down? And so I encourage students to say, let's pay attention to the signals here. One signal is when someone gets really slow, maybe their voice deepens, it's probably something we should pay attention to, right? They are trying to capture your attention by changing the pace, by changing the tone a little bit. It's probably something we want to write down. Also, when they speed up and they start talking really quickly and maybe they get a little bit louder and they get really excited about something, that's probably important to have too. And then my favorite phrase from professors is, this may or may not be on the quiz coming up next Tuesday. Please write that down. Why would you not write that down? Those are signals that we can get from them. And then we also need to think about just the signaling around the slides themselves. What is captured on the slide? We don't need to copy the images directly. That may take up too much time, but give yourself a vague idea or add a map of this later, right? Like give yourself a little note because that map was probably important enough for them to show it in class. Or if it was in your textbook, tell yourself, look at the map in the textbook, right? That's another great thing that we should be turning to. And so those are some of the signals that we need to pay attention. And all of these things are going to really start transforming the way we take notes. We're not just focused on let me get it all down or let me not put anything down whatsoever. And really, it does start to become very personal. And so I'm curious if you have any additional details around note taking that you might add, little tips like your abbreviation one that I just forgot to throw into this mix of
Well, no,
three
I
things.
think you mentioned that because I have my own abbreviations that make sense to me. And I use arrows for things like increase or decrease. And I think the abbreviations you have depend on the class you're taking.
Mm,
There are certain things that are going to lend themselves to particular abbreviations. If you're taking a Shakespeare class, there's no way you're going to write out the word Shakespeare every time. He, for the whole semester, may be known as capital S. That's good enough for that class, but that may not be an abbreviation you use in the next one. And so I just think the more students take notes and practice with them makes a difference. One of the things that I found worked when I was in college is I would try at the end of each week to go back for the week while I could still remember what happened and look over my notes.
mm,
And there were times where I would say, why was I writing all of this down? Had I just read the book, I wouldn't need to have all of these notes. Or there were times where I found some gaps and I noted, hey, these are some questions that I want to bring in for next week. If these aren't answered in class next week, I want to make sure I ask them. And so I found that it did help just on a Friday afternoon, take an hour, go over the week's notes. And I think that made a big difference.
Yeah. And I love that you're segueing us right into our conclusion here, which is we have those gaps, right? We have the spaces that we intentionally left in lecture. And that's because your notes are never actually finished. Notes really are this living document. It's not something that's just isolated and contained to lecture, but these are things that if we do them the right way, they should become our most valuable study tool later on because that's why we're sitting in this class for most of us to begin with, because we've got to take this exam and earn the grade. And so by having these gaps, this allows us to go in after class, and this is when we start fleshing out our understanding. We open up the textbook, we do the deep dives, we go to tutoring, we visit the office hours, we pay attention to the places that we circled and said, this confused me, or this was an aha moment, and we go back in and we flesh these things out. Now that we have time, dedicated time to just sit and be with our notes, we're not worried about capturing or paying attention to the genius of the professor. This is when we can do more deep thinking and start fleshing in all of those details into our notes. We're bulking up the skeleton that we created during lecture. And you bring up another great point. You said, had I just read my textbook, I would have known I didn't need to write all that down because it was in the textbook. And so I always advocate, and this definitely has to be another episode. There are things we need to do before we ever get to lecture to set ourselves up for success. And one of those things is the assigned readings. We'll go over a framework in the future where we don't have to read the readings word for word because no one has time for that. I mean, most college students just don't. And so, how do we extract the key pieces of information? And then once we have that, when we get to lecture, we know not to waste our time because we can go back to the book for certain things. And so we'll definitely figure out what is this full three-step process over time, knowing that today we just did a deep dive into during lecture. Here's how to get the most out of your lecture notes. But there's definitely more to this process. They're not dead once they're completed after lecture. Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
and I just think that's really important for people to hear that there is a better way to take notes, and it doesn't necessarily mean more. In this case, more is not better.
Absolutely. Right.
And that's a good
Less
thing to hear.
Absolutely. Less and more intentional is going to get you there. And so I would just love to share that if any of you are like, yes, give me more of this. I want to learn how I can take less notes. I want to learn how I don't have to read all the chapters in my assigned readings and actually get better results out of those things. And definitely head over to almamodern.com/library. And you're going to find just videos diving into these specific topics. This has sort of been the longer, fleshed out version, but there you're going to see everything in these bite-sized 5-minute little run-throughs. So definitely head over there. But I'm so excited. If any of you start using this process to take notes, send them to us. I'd love to see the email of, hey, look at my notes, or I shared this with my student and it's changing things. We'd love to hear that so that we know how to tailor our content to better suit all of you out there.
I love it. Work smarter, not harder.
That's it. Always.
Have a great week, everyone.
Bye, everyone.